How does trade policy actually get made? Does steel need protectionism? And what is the planner mindset? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of Econception. Econception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from heading 0601.10.45 of the U.S. Harmonized Tariff Schedule, which sets the tariff on lily bulbs at 55.7 cents per thousand. Now, please don't be confused. We are not recording from heading 0601.10.85. That's the heading that sets the tariff on Lily of the Valley pips at $1.44 per thousand. We're at lily bulbs, not Lily of the Valley pips. $1.44 per thousand is just too rich for my blood. All right, our guest today is Ed Gresser. Ed now works at the Progressive Policy Institute, but before that, he worked for the U.S. Trade Representative's office. He was there during both the Obama administration and the Trump administration in a non-political role. And so I wanted to have him on today to talk a little bit about how trade policy actually gets made and how that actually works in the United States. This is separate from questions about theory of trade or the economics of trade. This is more about the policy of it, how it actually happens in real life. So thanks so much for talking with us today, Ed.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So first thing, just so that our listeners know, what was it that you did in the Trade Representative's office? What was your job there? What were your responsibilities?
The job was Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Trade Policy and Economics. It was at the U.S. Trade Representative Office. USTR is the government's trade negotiating agency, also represents the U.S. to the World Trade Organization and coordinates trade policy development. The agency is divided into about 23 offices. Some of them deal with particular parts of the world, like Europe and the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, Western Hemisphere, and so on. Some deal with particular topics, intellectual property, industry, agriculture. The office I ran was called Trade Policy and Economics. So we handled USTR's economic research and use of trade data. I was the chair of a group called the Trade Policy Staff Committee, which is the senior civil servant level, which the 21 agencies with various trade policy responsibilities coordinate policy across the government. So it was among my jobs was to, whenever the U.S. government is going to put down a negotiating position or endorse a particular congressional proposal, USTR will send a paper out to all of these 21 agencies saying, here's what we're suggesting, here's why we think it's a good idea, here's what we think the outcome will be. And they have a chance to comment or to object, and we kind of work out whatever differences can be worked out at that level. So part of the job was really economic research and tracking trade data. The other was making sure that the government as a whole knows what each detail of U.S. trade policy is and has had a chance to comment.
And so that process of commenting and of working out exactly how trade policy is going to happen, how does that work? Because I think a lot of people, when they think about imposing a trade restriction, they think this is always going to be done in the national interest, that there's going to be, policymakers are very carefully studying what happens at every level. They're looking at what is going to be best for the United States as a whole when they are making these decisions, and that tons and tons of focus is going to go on to making sure that that absolutely happens, because this all is done in the public interest. But one of the things that you have talked about and that the Government Accountability Office has talked about in reports is that a lot of these exceptions or requests for exemptions from tariffs, first of all, there's just so many of them. And second of all, it's very hard to actually look at it through a public interest lens, because there's just so much there. There are so many people that are saying that they are a special case, that they are an exception that deserves special policy just for them. And so it's just, even if you wanted to do it in the public interest, it's just very, very difficult to.
Yeah, I think that's a totally fair comment. the basic problem is that different people in the country, different interest groups, different factions in Congress, sometimes different agencies within the administration see the national interest in different ways. And, sometimes you can smooth off the edges and combine them all into something that everyone agrees on, more or less. But sometimes you just have to choose in favor of one and the other and against the other. And so, objectively, which is the right for the national interest, it's not always possible to make that decision. The case you mentioned was the Trump administration's imposition of tariffs on China. This is a kind of lesson one in how it can be sort of difficult to maintain a particular definition and a focus on a particular goal in the national interest, and also how something that you do for one purpose may be quite objectionable to other people. So the Trump administration in 2018 ran something called a Section 301 investigation, which is a trade law feature of Chinese allegations of Chinese forced technology transfer and cyber theft, for which there's quite a good public record. These problems are serious and significant. They did a damage assessment, which was carried out partly by the USTR Economic Office and partly by the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House, which estimated about $50 billion worth of damage to the U.S. from this. The administration then said, we're going to impose tariffs on $50 billion worth of Chinese imports if you don't deal with eliminate these problems. So that went into effect, I believe, in the summer of 2018. China retaliated. The focus of policy quickly shifted from the technology transfer to retaliations and counter-retaliations. And we wound up with tariffs on about $300 or $350 billion worth of Chinese imports.
So just to be clear, it started off with 50 billion and it ended up at 350 billion.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, over several months of tit for tat retaliations. One of the things the administration did, which was professional and appropriate, was to post a notice saying, if you as a business believe these tariffs, which are mostly 25%, especially in the early rounds, are more than your business can support, you have the right to file a petition to say, please take this particular product off the list because it's essential to our business and we don't have a alternative source right now. And the administration expected about several hundred petitions to come in. But instead, according to a survey done a couple of years later by the Government Accountability Office, they got 52,746 petitions. So that's over the course of a year and a half. So on average, 100 a day. This was far more than the U.S. Trade Representative Office could handle. The USTR is a very small agency of 260 people or so. And so they kind of tried to deal with this by hiring a lot of consultants, about 35 lawyers and tariff system experts who would take in the petitions, review them, give a second look to a somewhat higher level reviewer, and objectively say, yes, this petition has merit. The company in question are making refrigerators, or they're making perfume, or they're making toothbrushes. They need an input from China, and they can't easily find a replacement. GAO, looking at this, said, well, we interviewed some of these consultants. On average, they were able to give each petition between 7 and 15 minutes worth of review. So if you think about, what is it like to make a appliance, it's complicated. As an outsider with tariff and trade law expertise, you wouldn't start unless by a very odd chance knowing very much about how to make a microwave oven or refrigerator or something like that. And you could probably learn it, within a couple of months with a lot of interviews and study. But really, this was almost an impossible task they were faced with. And so I assume the outcomes often are pretty random. They are, in pursuit of a policy meant to be in the national interest, but definitely at odds with the perceived interest of quite a lot of Americans on the ground in businesses and workers and so forth.
Yeah, that's a really important point, I think, because if you think about when politicians talk about the public interest, right? I mean, obviously, as you said, they have one conception, a different politician has a different conception, and so on. And we all sort of understand that at the political level. But then if you look at it too from the level of the people who are affected by the policy, they clearly have a different idea of the national interest too, right? Because if there was a clear national interest in doing this, 52,000 different petitions coming in telling you that, hey, look, this might be in the national interest, but it's not in our interest. At some point, at some point, the number of petitions that are coming in should probably be assigned to policymakers. Like, hey, maybe wait a minute, maybe this isn't in the national interest at all. If I can easily get 52,000, as you said, within for an agency with only a couple hundred people working at it, there's no possible way they could look through all of that, even with outside hired help.
Yeah, it's very difficult. I would make another point or two other points about this. One is that, as I mentioned, quickly after the $50 billion tariffs went into effect, if we got into a tit for tat escalation of tariffs with China, and that was sort of the big focus of the government. The Trump administration then in 2019 tried to work out an agreement with China, which wound up being called Phase 1 agreement. And this actually had quite little to do with the original reason for the 301 case. It was mostly focused on an attempt to balance trade, which is an entirely different topic. That did not succeed, and most people predicted it didn't have much chance of succeeding. Then, since then, we've been sort of, more or less not remembering the initial reason for this and just wondering what to do about the 301 tariffs. Should you keep them in place just, for the sake of it or for some particular purpose? Should you try to do an agreement on some other topic? Or should we try to reduce the number of tariffs that are burdensome to these businesses? So the government at times can start with a particular problem and view it as a big national interest, but it's not out of the question that it would lose focus on that problem and the issue would evolve and mutate into something entirely different. The other point to mention is that during the Trump administration, not so much during the Biden administration, there were a number of senior people, including Mr. Trump personally and Peter Navarro, who ran an office in the White House, who were frequently insisting that tariffs are a way to offload taxes onto foreigners and that China was paying for this. And I would say these petitions there's something like 52,000 affidavits that no, I'm the one who's paying this. It's not China. It is a pretty strong refutation of that error.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. I think when we talk about tariffs as taxes, right, we know that, economists know that they're not taxes on foreigners. They're taxes on Americans. And as you said, if they weren't taxes on Americans, why were 52,000 American businesses saying, I'm going to get taxed more? So tax policy is pretty clearly, under the Constitution, a power of Congress. This is something that, the Federalist Papers have more. There are more Federalist Papers devoted to the topic of taxation than there are to any other single topic. And it's pretty clear that they viewed this, the founders viewed this as a job for legislators because taxation affects so many people, and it's good to have representative bodies making these decisions rather than unelected ones. Yet, as you've described, between the Section 301, all these different laws that have allowed the executive to make tariff policy on its own. And so it is really giving the executive power to tax, which is a power that they're not supposed to have by themselves. How did it get to be this way? And what do you think can be done to try to get that power back where it belongs in the hands of legislators?
Yeah, I think that's a very important constitutional point. It's been a while since I've read the Federalist Papers, but I did check back in the Constitution. It says Congress has the sole power to lay taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. It's quite clear and plain. In terms of how did we get to this situation, there's a fairly long record with cases even back in the 19th century of Congress passing laws that say under very specific circumstances, we would like presidents to impose tariffs or to lift tariffs on particular types of products or countries. And an example of that is the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act that Roosevelt administration did, and then later on the Congressional Trade Negotiating Authority. And that says, we would like you to negotiate an agreement with Korea. And if you come back with the following agreement that includes, here's what we'd like to see in agriculture, here's what we'd like to see in service, et cetera, we will vote on it, and then you will have the power to lift tariffs on Korean goods. Similar procedure for protective things like anti-dumping law. Congress has set very clear and very detailed rules for how to do this. There are two laws, Section 232 and Section 301, passed in 1962 and in 1974, that really departed from this and gave presidents an extraordinary level of power to create their own tariff systems. Section 232 is the one that was used for steel and aluminum. There's a national security issue involved here, and presidents can do what they think necessary to adjust imports. And Section 301 is the one used for the China tariffs, and that says USTR, when faced with an act, policy, or practice that is unjustifiable and burdens or restricts U.S. commerce, can take such appropriate and feasible actions within the power of the president to enforce rights and obtain the elimination of these acts, policies, and practices. And both of those laws basically allow presidents to make their own judgments. The Commerce Secretary says, we think there's a national security issue here. President can then kind of do what he wants. And likewise, in the case of Section 301. And in both of these cases, it's allowed the Trump administration really to create entirely new tariff systems that aren't based in the tariff law or anything other than the recommendation of the former Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, and the former USTR, Robert Lighthizer, which allows presidents to act on their own. That I think had not really been thought through by Congresses at the time. For quite a long time, there was sort of a structure of trade policy making or trade policy views where president would be kind of a defender of open markets on the basis of economic efficiency and foreign policy. And Congress, maybe a little closer to the people, would be sort of concerned about particular businesses or industries facing stress and wanted to have escape valves. It didn't anticipate a situation where it would be the reverse. The president would be very eager to impose tariffs and Congress more concerned and worried. But in passing these laws, they really gave quite extraordinary power to the president. And I think we're never quite aware of how far a president could take it until the Trump administration decided to use it in these ways.
And so do you think there's any desire among members of Congress to take this power back for themselves? Because on one hand, Congress has, they've done this in many different areas of the law where they've delegated power away from themselves and towards the president because they don't want to be the ones on the hook for decisions, right? And so that's sort of understandable. Let the president figure it out. We don't want to make unpopular decisions.
Not very noble, but understandable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but, it's an understandable thing. They're people. They don't want to be on the hook for, they don't want to look bad for decisions that don't go well. It's reasonable. But now we're looking at a situation where a presidential administration could be coming in at the beginning of next year that has promised things, you've talked about how the first Trump administration created a whole new sort of tariff system on its own. But what Trump has been talking about on the campaign trail now is far more extreme than what he did the first time. He's talking about a 10% tariff on everything. He was talking about a 100% tariff on automobiles, things like that. And first of all, if we got 52,000 complaints for tariffs on China, imagine how many complaints you're going to get for tariffs on everything. But second of all, this just isn't a power that the president should have. Is there any desire among Congress? Because I can see both parties, from Democrats' point of view, because they don't like Trump, from Republicans' point of view, because they might want to have this power for themselves. I mean, just there's sort of a competing ambitions here on the side of Congress. One is to say, I don't want to be on the hook for unpopular decisions. The other is to say, I want to have power and be able to exercise it. And so one of those has won out for a while now. But now that we have a president that could be coming in and taking that to a whole other level, maybe that will tip the balance back the other way, and Congress will want to take some of that power back. I'm not really sure which one of those views is correct, and I'm not sure you do either. But if you have any thoughts on that, I'd be interested to hear them.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel there's a lot of unhappiness in Congress. They're aware that they have given away some significant powers. I would like to think that you take an oath to defend the Constitution, and one of the very clear rules of the Constitution is that no individual should be able to impose his own tax. That should be a decision of the public through the legislature. And so I would like to think that Congress is aware of how much power they've conceded. There would be fairly simple ways to deal with this. For example, I could imagine you passed a law saying it didn't change the 301 law or the 232 law, but said decisions on this have to be ratified by a vote of Congress. That would basically solve the problem. And as you say, the Trump campaign proposal is quite dramatic. You looked this up the other day. If you had a 10% overall tariff, and assuming it was added on top of the current system, that would be the highest tariff rate we've had since 1936. It's quite a dramatic change in America's role in the world, and quite a dramatic change in a way in U.S. tax policy. If you're going to rely more on tariffs and less on corporate income taxes, that means you're going to be shifting taxation away from some of the services industries like financial services or law firms or real estate, and onto businesses and individuals who buy and use a lot of goods. So that would be like manufacturing and farmers and restaurants and building contractors. And before we do something like that, Congress should really think about, is this right? Is this what we want?
Absolutely. And I think the answer ought to be no, especially if we look around and we see how long it takes to build things, how expensive construction is in the United States, how politicians are constantly talking about the need to rejuvenate manufacturing, and now you want to put higher taxes on inputs for goods. Half of all U.S. imports are inputs to U.S. production that then gets either consumed here or exported.
Yeah, I mean, there is a quite good study done by the U.S. International Trade Commission of precisely this issue related to the steel and aluminum tariffs. This was released almost exactly a year ago, March 2023. And they said that as of 2020 and 2021, those 232 tariffs on metals had raised output of steel and aluminum by about $2.2 billion. And had decreased output of auto parts and machinery and tools and cutlery by about $3.5 billion. So there are definitely losers when you do these things, and sometimes they lose more than the winners get. And before we go into something like that, we should understand that this is the likely outcome, and Congress should say, yes, we think this is worth it, or no, put a stop to this.
Definitely. Well, thanks so much for walking us through this, Ed. It was great to learn from your experience and expertise on this, and thanks for being on eConception.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. Great to be on.
Does the steel industry really need protectionism? You'll hear from a lot of people that, well, free trade's nice for a lot of things, but maybe for steel, we really need it. Because the military needs steel. And anything that's necessary for national defense, that can be an exception for free trade. Now, it's true that there can be exceptions for free trade based on national defense, and it's true that the military needs steel. But let's ask ourselves, is steel protectionism actually helping national defense? Now, you can probably find a lot of free trade economists that will have criticisms of this line of reasoning, but maybe you think they're coming from a point of view, that they're just biased against protectionism and they don't want to give it a fair shot. So let's not look to an economist this time. Let's look to a former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Industrial Policy. That's not the kind of job that a doctrinaire free trader holds, and I think we can trust that he's probably coming at it from a national defense point of view. Well, William Greenwalt was the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Industrial Policy from 2006 to 2009. Before that, he worked for the Senate Armed Services Committee. He's also worked in the private sector for defense companies. So he's seen this from every angle, and he's coming at it from a national defense point of view. And he says not only is steel protectionism not necessary, it actually hurts national security. Here's how he gets there. First thing he notes is that the Pentagon has bought significantly less than 1% of the U.S. steel industry's output in a given year. So protecting 100% of the steel for 1% of the output that the military is using doesn't really seem like a very good trade. I should mention that this was all in a piece that he wrote early in March for the publication Breaking Defense. And then he says, so not only does it not make sense just on that account, but protectionism has actually harmed national defense because forcing the Pentagon to comply with all of the regulations that go along with protectionism and domestic content requirements actually drives up costs for the military, slows down projects, and prevents them from getting the steel that they need. Now, this is the same reason that domestic content requirements are a problem for anybody. We see this in lots of different situations where trying to comply with arcane rules about the percentage value that has to come from certain countries or can't come from certain countries ends up costing more in time, in work hours, and ultimately in not being able to deliver the product than it would be if you just went abroad for it. Now, you would think that at least the steel industry would have a sense of national obligation when a national defense need arises because they have been the beneficiary of so much protectionism over so many years. But Greenwalt was Undersecretary of Defense for Industrial Policy during the MRAP program, which was a program building armored vehicles to protect American service members from roadside bombs in the Middle East. And he says it was probably the largest emergency steel-centric defense program that the U.S. has embarked on since the production of Liberty ships in World War II. This was a $50 billion program. He did a lot of special steel. And his job at the Pentagon at the time was to go out and find this steel. Well, it turns out he was really unable to find it in the United States. The steel companies didn't do it. One steel company did, but in order for them to make the steel in the United States, which is what they wanted to do, they would need inputs from Mexico. Other steel industry lobbyists lobbied the federal government to not give a waiver to allow them to get those inputs from Mexico. And this steel company ended up being bought by a Russian company after that. And so Greenwalt says, look, this might be nice in theory that you think you're protecting the steel industry for national defense. But when it actually came time, when we needed steel in an emergency for national defense, steel industry wasn't there. Instead, he says, the Pentagon sourced the steel from Sweden, Germany, Israel, and Australia. Well, those are all friendly countries to the United States. It's not like he was going across to adversary nations. There's no reason that the military should have to wait around for the domestic steel industry to get its act together, even though that same industry has been the beneficiary of so much government policy. Well, it has a pressing need for steel, and so it makes perfect sense for the Pentagon to look to our allies to supply that steel. And so Look, the domestic steel industry, they've been paying big bucks for the best lawyers and lobbyists in Washington, including, by the way, Donald Trump's trade representative, Robert Lighthizer, who was a steel lobbyist for many years before joining government and continuing to push steel protectionism in that role. We don't need to buy the spin on this. There are many, many more Americans who are employed and who consume products that use steel as an input than there are Americans that produce steel. And so the fundamental imbalance there should lead us to the conclusion that it's actually better to have cheaper steel that we can then use to make more valuable things instead of protecting it, even in the name of national defense, because when it was needed for national defense, the domestic companies weren't there, and we had to look abroad anyway. Now, this kind of all ties in with something that we'll call the planner mindset. It's this idea that we need to have plans in place for every contingency to make sure that everything goes well. Because if we don't have plans in place beforehand, everything's just going to be a disaster. We see that mindset with a lot of calls for protectionism, but we also see it in other areas as well. I think one good example of this is an article in The Atlantic by Juliette Kayyem. It's called "The Baltimore Bridge Collapse and America's Fragility." The Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore collapsed in what appears at this point to be a terrible accident when a cargo ship ran into one of the supports for the bridge, and the entire bridge collapsed. Kayyem looks at this, and I should mention she's a Homeland Security program chair at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. So this is an academic writing in The Atlantic. And she says, "The rapid collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore early this morning touched off a frantic search for survivors and gave Americans a frightening reminder of the fragility of the many systems that allow us to go about our lives." So let's just pause there. There's a lot of different things you could take away from this tragedy. Obviously, it is a tragedy. There was a construction crew on the bridge when it collapsed, and it appears at this point that several of those individuals have lost their lives. It is also true that, according to the governor of Maryland, that the ship gave a mayday call when it was headed towards the bridge. The ship had some kind of power malfunction. It was not under the control of the crew at the time. They were unable to steer it away, and so they sent a mayday call, which then was received by the bridge authorities, who were able to block off the bridge. Now, this all happened at 1:30 in the morning, so traffic was pretty light anyway. But they were able to close off the bridge to prevent more people from being on it when it did collapse. So you could look at this and say, wow, that's great. That is a very good thing that they were able to do that. That the people on the ship had the presence of mind to make sure to alert port authorities, that the port authorities were able to pass that information on to the bridge authorities and make sure that it got closed off. So you could look at this and say, well, clearly there was sort of a plan in place, right? But the author of this piece is not talking about that sort of plan. She's talking about some bigger plans. She says, "In the meantime, the public and its elected leaders must improvise answers to a question that few people were contemplating last night. What would happen if a major piece of our infrastructure disappeared in the dark?" Now, look, I don't know what would happen if a major piece of our infrastructure disappeared in the dark. Obviously, it would be really bad. Obviously, this bridge collapse is really bad. But the idea that there's a bunch of people sitting around thinking about these things all the time, and that this is actually something that we should do more of, that we should sit around and plan for these extremely unlikely events, it doesn't make a ton of sense. I mean, what would happen if we were invaded by aliens? What would happen if I got struck by lightning? I can think of all sorts of very improbable things. But by their very nature, improbable things are things that we don't expect. And so if there are already things that we don't expect, there's going to be tons and tons of improbable events that we don't even think of, that we can't possibly plan for because we didn't even think they could happen. I would list some examples, but I can't because it's impossible. This is really part of the problem with the planner mindset. If you can't think of all the things to plan for, then you're still going to be surprised even if you think you've covered everything. Now, Juliette Kayyem, the author of this piece, she immediately pivots in this piece to say that a lot of American infrastructure is in poor shape. What's clear across the country is that even as the U.S. tries to ramp up repairs to our old bridges, rails, roads, and dams, we are not keeping up with their decay, much less bringing them into the modern era, building more redundancy into our systems, or developing contingency plans for sudden disruptions. Now that just has nothing to do with this accident. A container ship crashed into the bridge. There was nothing wrong with the bridge. We know this from, for example, the Federal Highway Administration, which gave the bridge satisfactory ratings across the board for its structural integrity. We know this from the fact that the bridge has been there since 1977, with ships going under it in both directions every single day. The bridge was not known to have safety issues. So there's no evidence that this bridge was in poor shape at all. So bringing this up as some kind of general issue doesn't make very much sense. But she also talks about building redundancy into our systems. Well, guess what? There are 3 highway crossings of Baltimore Harbor. The other 2 are tunnels. Those tunnels are fine. Now, if this bridge didn't collapse, and let's say instead one of the tunnels collapsed, Kayyem could just as easily come out and say, we should have been planning for the tunnel collapse. Maybe we should have. But this incident is the only reason that she's writing this piece. If this hadn't happened, she could write the exact same piece for some other tragedy that happens that no one expected. It's completely unrelated to what she's trying to make into a generalized problem. It's not a generalized problem. That's another instinct of the planner mindset, trying to generalize everything, trying to put it all into one cohesive theory of everything that happens, instead of saying, this was a terrible accident, how are we going to respond to it? And what you'll find too is that planners, in arguing for planning of this sort, will often reveal that they don't know some key facts about the things that they're talking about. Kayyem's article is no exception. As I already mentioned, she talks about redundancy, even though there already is redundancy to cross Baltimore Harbor. She also talks about, she says that the now destroyed bridge was the preferred highway route for trucks carrying hazardous materials. Now, it wasn't the preferred highway route. Of the 3 crossings, it is the only highway route that hazardous materials are permitted on because the other 2 are tunnels. And Maryland officials don't allow hazardous materials in the tunnels. But it also ignores that the key bridge that collapsed is part of I-695, which is a beltway around Baltimore. The bridge is on the eastern half. The western half is completely on land. Trucks carrying hazardous materials still have that option available to them. Now, obviously, this is not to say that this is no problem. It is a huge problem. It's terrible. And we don't want bridges to collapse. That's why we maintain them. That's why we try to make sure that this stuff doesn't happen. But every once in a while, freak accidents do happen. But are people able to respond to that? Kayyem thinks they're not. She says, for example, employers will have to relieve commuters from needing to travel. School children and others will experience delays, if not cancellations. Work and learn from home alternatives, at least for some time, will need to be instituted. But they won't. This bridge is not the only road in all of Baltimore. First of all, just because of where it's located, no one is taking this bridge to school. Probably shouldn't say no one. Maybe somebody does. But it's very unlikely that somebody is because it really connects industrial areas. And as I said, is part of an interstate highway. So it's not like there's businesses on the side of the road. And second, the idea that people need to work from home because there's a traffic problem. Well, they will need to take a different way to get to work. And they can figure that out. Might need to leave a little bit earlier. They can do that. They're human beings. They can solve that problem. We don't need to solve it for them. The planner mindset says that everything has to be part of the plan. We have to keep accumulating more and more things into the plan. But really, people will be able to figure out solutions to this. So she talks at the end about resiliency. Just ask yourself, what's more resilient? One plan with one planner or a small group of planners who think that they can try to foresee every future problem, or a decentralized system where lots and lots of people make their own individual plans, and those plans then interact with each other and inform and improve over time? What's more resilient? I'm going to say it's the decentralized one, because that has the ability to adjust. It has the ability to take relevant knowledge from certain areas that people in other areas wouldn't possibly be able to have. And it allows that knowledge to be incorporated into the decision-making process of lots of other people in such a way that will be most useful to them. That makes a lot more sense than the opposite, because freak accidents do happen. Things that we didn't foresee do happen. The answer is whether we're going to be dependent on a couple of plans in order to get out of it, or whether individuals on the spot will be able to do it themselves. Now it's time for the paper of the episode. But before we go to that, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It will help us to know that you enjoy the show and makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. I let Ed pick the paper of the episode from February of this year by Miguel Acosta and Lydia Cox, The Regressive Nature of the U.S. Tariff Code, Origins and Implications. Here's Ed to tell you about it.
The paper I'm recommending is quite a new one. It's published February 4th, 2024, by two young economists, Lydia Cox, who's an assistant professor at University of Wisconsin, and Miguel Acosta, who's a staff economist at the Federal Reserve. And they do a kind of really deep dive into the U.S. tariff system, and particularly the consumer goods system, to analyze it for who's paying and what could be done to make it a little more fair. The paper is called The Regressive Nature of the U.S. Tariff Code, Origins and Implications. And what they look at is something that's very unusual and little known and unpleasing about the U.S. tariff system, which is that it typically taxes cheap and simple consumer goods much more heavily than very closely related luxury goods. In the paper, they use an example of forks, so that a silver-plated fork has a permanent 0% tariff, and a fork which is made of stainless steel and costs more than 25 cents has an 8.5% tariff. And a fork that's also stainless steel and costs less than a quarter has a 15.8% tariff. And they look through the entire U.S. tariff system, 11,414 lines, an extremely complicated system, and determine that this is systematic, that almost everywhere you look, where there are consumer goods or differentiations between different types of products, the expensive luxury is taxed lightly and the cheap and simple good is taxed very heavily. This is true in clothing, it's true in shoes, it's true in forks and spoons and drinking glasses and so forth. So they demonstrate that. They trace this back almost 60 years to choices made during the 1940s and choices made during the 1960s and more recently, which generally cut U.S. tariffs more heavily on luxuries than on cheap goods. And then more recently to the fact that these rates have been kind of buried. That in today, there are no American companies making forks that cost less than a quarter. There's one that makes them at prices of $7 or more each. So, but nonetheless, this 15% tariff on cheap forks remains in place. So they demonstrate that. And then finally, they look at what would happen if you equalize these things, setting aside whether overall the rate should be cut or not. If we did not tax cheap and simple goods the same, more heavily than luxuries, they estimate about $3.6 billion worth of consumer savings, and families in the bottom 10% of income bracket getting 4 times as much benefit as families in the top tier income bracket. So their conclusion is there's a lot of good you can do for low-income people only by equalizing tariff rates to eliminate regressivity. And in most cases, these are products that are not made in the United States anyway. So it's a great paper. It is very innovative. It's very complete. And it's a couple of very young, very talented economists looking at a problem that deserves a close look.
Awesome. Thanks so much. The Regressive Nature of the U.S. Tariff Code, Origins and Implications by Acosta and Cox. Read it. That's all for today. Remember, the economy is complicated. Nobody has all the answers. The markets work.